Iruka knew things must be dire because Eagle and Viper both turned up at his flat that evening. They even knocked at the front door, which was unheard of and gave the whole meeting a tone of formality that immediately sent Iruka's thoughts spiraling into worst-case scenarios. They were here to disown him from the Umbu family, they were here to tell him that something terrible had happened to Hound, they were here to say out loud all of the hateful things he'd been saying to himself all day. Some of that terror must have shown on his face because Viper paused in the entryway and said, "Don't look so scared, sweetie, we're here to help," and Iruka was so relieved that he almost burst into tears. He tried to press down the lump in his throat as he joined them in the living room, curling up on the couch with Viper beside him and Eagle sitting cross-legged on the floor opposite. "Is Hound still really mad at me?" Iruka asked. He knew what the answer was going to be, but his chest still ached when Viper and Eagle exchanged a glance and took a moment before they answered. "He's still quite upset," Eagle said in that light tone adults used when they were trying to spare your feelings. "We did have a chat with him when we heard, but we think he needs a bit of space to cool down." "How much space?" Iruka asked. He couldn't imagine Hound allowing anyone to sit with him and comfort him like this, and the thought of Hound being miserable all alone was too much to bear. "I think a couple of days should be enough," Viper said. "Any longer than that and wounds of this kind start to fester." She hesitated. "I have to be honest with you, Iruka, it won't be easy to mend things. Hound has always been a troubled boy. He doesn't have many friends. That's why Sandaime-sama was trying to pair you two up in the first place. Hound could really use someone like you in his life." "All I've done is upset him," Iruka mumbled, staring down at his lap. "He was trying to be nice to me and I fucked it up. Maybe I'm just a really bad friend and he needs someone better." "Oh, honey, no," Viper said. At the same time Eagle said, "That isn't true. You just need to prove to him that you really do want to be his friend," Eagle said. "How am I supposed to do that when he doesn't want to talk to me?" Iruka asked, and he knew how pathetic he sounded but he couldn't help it. "It's not like I can go over to his house. I can only see him when he's working, so he has to come to me, and he won't." "You don't know that," Viper said. "I'm sure he wants you two to make up just as much as you do. Why would he? He didn't like me until a few days ago. I don't even know why he changed his mind in the first place." "What made you change your mind about him?" Viper asked. Iruka thought about this. "I don't know. I guess I'd never really tried to talk to him before Sandaime-sama gave me the mission. I didn't know him properly when all we did was argue. He was such a massive pain." He wished he could see Hound that way again, but now he'd realized there was a personality under all that griping and scolding, he couldn't unsee it. He'd only glimpsed its outline, but it had been enough to get him hooked. How could he rest now, never knowing what Hound was truly like? "Befriending an Umbu was never going to be easy," Eagle said. "There are so many things we can't share, as much as we'd like to. Personally, I'd have classed it as an A-rank mission." "Don't call it a mission," Viper hissed. "That's where the trouble started." "It got them talking, though, and that can only be a good thing," Eagle argued. "Otherwise we'd never have reached this point." "Can you talk to him again?" Iruka asked, before they could bicker any more. "And tell him that I'm really sorry and I want to see him." "Of course we will," Viper said at once. "This will all work out just fine, sweetie. Don't stress too much about it." That was easier said than done. 3 days passed and Hound didn't come. Viper and Eagle had done their best. They had shown up and said encouraging things and a couple of times had told Iruka when and where Hound would be on guard duty, but Iruka was too afraid to go and pester Hound at work. He didn't want a public confrontation, or to get Hound in trouble for arguing on the job, and if he was honest with himself, the more time that went by, the more convinced he became that Hound hated him and their budding friendship was over forever. The only thing worse than thinking it would be to hear Hound say it, and so Iruka found himself actively avoiding all the places in the village where Hound might be. Viper was rapidly losing patience with both of them. "If you won't go to him and he won't come to you, then how are you supposed to talk it out?" she'd asked. "Maybe we just won't," Iruka said from where he was currently lying in bed with his face buried in his pillow. At this point he knew full well that he was throwing a pity party for himself, but he couldn't seem to make himself stop. Viper had sighed and left him to it, and Iruka had felt even more awful after she'd gone. That had been the night before. This morning, Eagle showed up in the flat while Iruka was brushing his teeth. He came out of the bathroom and didn't even jump when he found an umbu making his bed. "Good morning, Iruka," Eagle said brightly as he fluffed up Iruka's pillows. "I thought you could use something to cheer you up today. Like a properly made bed." Iruka asked. "That too, but today we're actually having a master class on seals and traps and I thought you might like to come down and take a look at the setup before the session starts." Iruka perked up at that. "Am I allowed?" he asked. "As long as you promise not to touch anything," Eagle said. "They're out in the umbu training fields, but I can sneak you in. The training doesn't start for another couple of hours, so we've got time for a quick nose around." Iruka had only seen high-level traps in books before, and reading about them wasn't nearly as satisfying as seeing them in person. For the first time in days, he felt a burst of energy. "Sure, I'm ready now," he said, grabbing a shoulder bag and stuffing pen and paper into it so he could take notes. "Let's go." The umbu training grounds were some of the furthest grounds from the village proper. They weren't far from the Forest of Death, though they were tucked into their own little corner bordering the village wall and sealed off from the public training areas with powerful wards and a tall fence. Despite the security measures, Eagle explained, it was common for non-operatives to enter the grounds and they had a whole system set up in the wards so that external trainers and medics could be allowed through. That system, which Iruka furiously scribbled notes on, was a little laminated guest pass that visitors wore around their neck, complete with a seal inside that could be imbued with a little chakra from any active umbu and would then allow the wearer to step through the wards unharmed. Eagle was hazy on how it worked, and Iruka would have killed to take a look at the seal dangling on the end of his lanyard, but it was hidden behind a piece of card bearing the umbu symbol and the word guest. He made a note to bug Asuka-sensei about it when he next had a seals class. The umbu training grounds themselves were nothing special. Iruka wasn't sure what he'd expected, but they looked no different to the regular training grounds. Some of them were open spaces while some were planted with trees and undergrowth, like miniature forests, and it was to one of these that Eagle led him now. "You know where the traps are, right?" Iruka asked. "I don't want to accidentally set one off." "Don't worry about that," Eagle said. "I'd never put you in danger, Iruka." Iruka was about to ask another question when he heard voices from up ahead. The trees provided enough cover that he couldn't see much more than a flash of umbu armor, but there were definitely two other people on the training field with them. "I thought you said no one else would be here this early," he said, squinting through the trees. Eagle didn't reply, and Iruka was about to turn and ask if they were going to get in trouble when the two other umbu got close enough to step out into plain view. It was Viper and Hound. Of course it fucking was. Hound stopped dead as soon he noticed Iruka. Then he turned around abruptly, and Viper caught him by the back of his shirt before he could slip off. "Since when do umbu run away?" she asked sharply. "I'm sure you've faced down scarier things than a teenage boy." "I'm not running away," Hound mumbled. "I have work to do. Somewhere else." Seeing him hurt. Seeing him try to leave hurt worse. It was one thing to know that Hound didn't want to talk to him, but it was another to witness it. Iruka was vaguely aware that Eagle had moved a little closer, presumably in case he also tried to make a break for it, but Iruka felt like he was wearing ankle weights. He couldn't have moved if he'd wanted to. "Well, since you're both here," Eagle said brightly, "why don't you finally have a talk?" Hound directed his best glare at Eagle, and Viper moved behind him to block off any further escape attempts. "You two set this up," Hound accused. Viper rolled her eyes. "I see they don't call you a genius for nothing. Now are you both going to act your age and stop this nonsense?" Iruka had no idea what to say, but he was desperately trying to catch Hound's eye. Hound, however, was looking everywhere but at Iruka. "Stop trying to act like my mum," Hound snapped. "I said I'd do it when I'm good and ready." Iruka's heart jumped. "Really?" he blurted out. "You do want to talk to me again?" He sounded so hopeful, so needy, and he barely even cared. Hound's gaze flicked up, catching on Iruka's face just for a moment before it darted away again. "I don't know," he said stiffly. "Not today." He made as if to move away again, but Viper grabbed him by the shoulders. "Sorry, honey," she said, "but I know you too well to let you put it off any longer." She and Eagle exchanged a swift look, and then suddenly Iruka felt hands on his back and Eagle gave him a firm push just as Viper shoved Hound towards him. The two of them stumbled into each other, Iruka yelping as his nose collided with Hound's shoulder, and he dimly felt a small flare of chakra blossom somewhere very close. He didn't have time to worry about that, though. He was more concerned with how Hound had instinctively caught him and was now holding Iruka against his very uncomfortable chest plate. They both seemed to recover at the same time, and both immediately jerked away from each other. Iruka took a step back and his shoulder blades smacked into something hard. Hound made a small, surprised noise as he failed to take more than a step either, and Iruka finally tore his gaze away from Hound and realized what had happened. There was a barrier surrounding the two of them, maybe 4 feet wide. Outside it, Viper and Eagle had come together to survey their handiwork. "That went even more smoothly than I thought," Viper said with satisfaction. "Did you trapped us?" Iruka spluttered. "We learned from the best," Eagle said, winking at him. "It wasn't the most sophisticated setup in the world but it seems to have done the job." "Very funny," Hound said, banging a fist on the barrier. "Now let us out." "What would be the point of that?" Eagle asked. "After all the trouble we went to lure you both here." "I'm working," Hound said furiously. "You are wasting my time." "Let me out." "You are in a timeout, mister," Viper said, folding her arms and glaring right back. "You had your chance to sort this out your own way, but since you weren't mature enough, you're doing it our way. That barrier will stay up for 1 hour. We're going to leave you here and give you privacy and you can either talk it out or you can sulk in silence. Though if I come back in an hour and you haven't sorted things out, I'll be very disappointed in you both." They were gone before Hound could protest further, although that didn't stop him from calling them a string of names that definitely would have got him grounded a second time if Viper had still been in earshot. And then he and Iruka were alone. They stood in silence for a long, awkward moment, studiously avoiding eye contact. The barrier really was very small, and even with them both pressed up against opposite sides, there was barely any space between them. Even Hound wouldn't be able to ignore Iruka for a whole hour when they were only an arm's length apart. Iruka said, and Hound glanced at him, their eyes meeting for only the second time since they'd entered the training ground. It was enough to make Iruka flustered, and he forgot whatever he'd been about to say, assuming he'd ever really known. He wasn't much of a think before you speak type of person at the best of times, which, now he thought about it, was maybe where a lot of his problems originated. "Spit it out," Hound said gruffly, and while his tone was not inviting in the slightest, Iruka was suddenly buoyed with hope. After all, spit it out was a lot better than shut up and don't talk to me until we can leave. "I'm really sorry I hurt your feelings," Iruka said. "I didn't mean to." Hound snorted and looked away. He'd folded his arms tightly across his chest plate as though he needed another level of protection beyond the armor. "You're just sorry you got caught," he mumbled. "That isn't true." How could he convince Hound otherwise when Hound had already made up his mind? Hound didn't want to be convinced, that much was clear. It must be so easy, Iruka thought bitterly, to think the worst of him, even though Iruka had apologized twice now. Even though Hound had already punished him by leaving him in misery for days without a word. Wasn't that enough? What else did he have to do to get Hound to listen to him? "I'm not sorry I took the mission," he said suddenly. "I really didn't like you before, you know. You were always such an asshole to me." "You were the asshole," Hound shot back. "Always running around setting traps and getting in trouble, but for some reason the other umbu let you off all the time. I was the only one doing my job and trying to make you stop. I wasn't hurting anyone, they were just pranks." "They could have hurt people if you weren't careful," Hound said, and he gave Iruka a meaningful look. "As you've proved so recently." "Oh, screw you, that was your fault. I would have been fine if you hadn't come sticking your nose in. You know, you're not the only umbu who meddles in my business, not by a long shot, but you're the only one who's mean about it." "I'm not mean," Hound snapped. "You're just a brat who gets special treatment from everyone else, so you throw a tantrum when you don't get it from me too." "Special treatment? What?" you mean that other people are nice to me because I lost my fucking parents? Do you want me to apologize for being orphaned? You're not the only orphan in the village, but the rest of us aren't so desperate for attention that we need 20 umbu to be our stand-in parents. Hound's voice had risen to a yell at the end, something raw and ugly cracking through his anger. Iruka was reminded again of how little he really knew about Hound. He had never known that Hound was capable of such intense emotions, and he felt a spark of vindication that he'd managed to bring them to the surface. Are you jealous of me? Iruka asked, and knew he'd got it exactly right when Hound flinched back as though Iruka had thrown a knife. What's there to be jealous of? Hound asked, and scoffed too loudly, swatting a hand through the air as though to parry the blade. You said I was the favorite child, back in the hospital, Iruka said, refusing to be diverted from his course. I thought you were joking, but you really meant it, didn't you? Were you Umbu's favorite child before I showed up? That's not, you're totally wrong, Hound insisted. I don't need anyone to look after me. I'm not a kid. Yes, you are. You're what, 15? 16, Hound snapped, and then smacked a hand over his mask where his mouth would be. Shit. He tried to glare at Iruka, but it was more panicky than angry. Stop tricking me into telling you things. I could arrest you. You could, Iruka agreed, but you'd get in so much trouble with Viper. Hound's glare got nastier, and Iruka felt a smug little thrill that he'd brought out this side of him. Hound was always so in control all the time, with that haughty, stick-up-his-ass attitude like he thought he was better than Iruka. There was a savage joy in dragging him down to Iruka's level and making him act his age. They felt more like equals this way. You don't have to be jealous, Iruka said. They only get on your case because that's what parents do. It doesn't mean they've replaced you or don't care about you anymore. Hound was pressed very tightly against his corner of the barrier. I know that, he said in a small, tight voice. I don't think you do. Iruka took a step forwards, and if he hadn't been in Hound's personal space before then he definitely was now. Hound froze like a cornered rabbit. You know why Sandaime gave me that mission? It was because he was worried about you. He wanted you to have more friends. And that's the same reason why Eagle and Viper went to all this trouble to make us talk. It wasn't me they were worried about, not really. You're the one who got hurt, and they hate to see you sad. Hound stared at him for a hesitant moment and then turned and looked out through the barrier wall at the trees and shrubs surrounding them. You're saying they set a trap for me and then left me here because they're trying to make me happy, he asked. I never said they were good at it, Iruka said. But yeah, basically. They're your family, and I'm not trying to steal them away from you. They just hold you to a different standard than me because you're older and you're Umbu, so they don't think they should baby you the way they baby me. Hound was quiet as he thought about that. Iruka didn't interrupt, he just waited and tried not to fidget. You said you weren't sorry for taking the mission, Hound said eventually. He looked at Iruka expectantly, and it was strangely comforting that they were back to this familiar routine of Hound only half voicing his thoughts as though he thought Iruka could read his mind. This time, though, Iruka thought he understood what Hound was getting at. If Sandaime-sama hadn't asked me to, I wouldn't have tried to get to know you, he said. So even though it hurt you, I don't regret it, because it meant I got to see a different side of you. And I guess, it was his turn to look away. Well, I guess you're not the total asshole I thought you were. Wow, that's the nicest thing you've ever said to me. What I'm trying to say, Iruka ground out, is that it started as a mission, but the more I hung out with you, the more I actually wanted to be your friend. I forgot about the mission completely after you fucked up my seals. I wasn't thinking about it at all when we spent time together. You don't have to believe me if you want to keep sulking, but I really did want to be friends with you. You did want to be friends with me? Hound asked, and Iruka thought he heard a hint of panic in his tone. I still do, Iruka assured him. There was a silence, which stretched long enough that Iruka thought he was going to be rejected after all. He could almost hear Hound overthinking everything he'd said. But when Hound finally spoke, he didn't shoot Iruka down. Why? He asked, and he sounded uncharacteristically vulnerable. Iruka forced his gaze back up to meet Hound's. His heart was suddenly pounding because he knew what he had to say. Because, he said, screwing up his courage, I like you too, you idiot. Hound blinked rapidly and a flush stole down from beneath the mask, over his neck. Take that, Anko, Iruka thought. He wasn't the only one who blushed when someone said that so directly. Hound started. That's, He gave up trying to form a whole sentence. Thanks. Iruka rolled his eyes, trying to look nonchalant, though his cheeks felt a little warm too. So are we, okay? He asked. They were both trying very hard to avoid eye contact in the most casual manner possible. I'm not your mission anymore. You're not my mission anymore, Iruka agreed. He paused. Though I might still ask to get paid for it, if you're not going to throw another strop. I could use the money, and a B rank will look really good on my record. It was a B rank? Hound asked, and Iruka couldn't tell if he thought that was too high or too low, but the indignation in his voice made Iruka laugh. I'll buy you a friendship bracelet with my earnings, he teased, though from the wistful way Hound glanced down at his wrist, Iruka thought he might be taking it seriously. Hey. Maybe he really would make Hound a bracelet, just to see if he'd wear it. We're okay, Hound said very quietly, almost shyly. He was kind of cute when he wasn't being an asshole. Then he cleared his throat and stood up a little straighter. So now we've sorted all that out, do you think you can take down the barrier? Iruka pressed a palm to the barrier wall. He did know a seal that might manage to free them, but he wasn't sure he wanted to try it. Being stuck in here together wasn't so bad, and there couldn't be all that long left until Viper and Eagle came back anyway. Might as well make the most of their time out. Sorry, he said. Nothing I can do. Guess we're stuck here for a little bit longer. He could have been wrong, but he didn't think Hound was as disappointed as he pretended to be. Maybe, just maybe, he was even a tiny bit pleased. After Eagle and Viper had set them free, with infuriating smugness that their scheme had worked, which Hound and Iruka tried to dispel by pretending, in mutually unspoken consent, that they were still annoyed at each other, Iruka didn't expect to see Hound again for a while. He was, therefore, taken aback when his window slid open shortly before sunset and Hound perched on his windowsill as awkwardly as ever. Come in then, Iruka said, waving him in from his seat on the floor. He had his seals textbook laid open in front of him and a notebook full of sketches of seal designs, though he put down his pen as Hound obediently lowered himself to the floor. Hound came over and crouched beside him, taking in Iruka's messy scribbles. You're making seals again, he said, and he sounded pleased. Iruka felt a warm little glow in his chest. Yeah. They're more barrier modifications. Remember how you said I could try and use lightning? Iruka gestured to the textbook, which was open to a page on using elemental seals. That's what I'm working on now. Hound tugged the textbook closer, looking at the key of symbols on the left page. Which one means lightning? This one, Iruka said, pointing it out. You said I could combine it with ice, but I've never used a lightning seal before, so I thought I should start by making an electrified barrier. It's not that hard, I could probably have something ready to test by tomorrow. Will you, need any help? Iruka had been planning to ask if Hound would come with him. He was still a little nervous about testing out his more violent barriers, but having someone else there might help him feel brave. As long as you don't distract me this time, he said. I won't, Hound promised. With that agreed, a silence descended over them, and it wasn't wholly uncomfortable, but it would be if it carried on for too long. They were still so new at this friendship thing. Iruka wanted to ask what Eagle and Viper had said earlier after he'd left, but he didn't want to risk bringing up their fight again in case it made Hound angry again. While he was still casting around for a safer subject, Hound let out a sudden noise of delighted surprise. What? Iruka asked, startled, as Hound leapt up and stepped over the textbook so he could swipe something up off the coffee table. You've read this too? Hound asked, and Iruka realized with a sudden wave of horror that he was holding Ika Fabulous. No. Iruka said, which was sort of true. He hadn't read it cover to cover, but he had finally given in to his curiosity and flicked through it, his face growing steadily hotter until he'd come across a passage so explicit that he'd slammed the book shut and thrown it across the room. He didn't remember picking it up, so presumably an umbu had tidied it away onto the table at some point. You should, Hound said, with far too much enthusiasm. This isn't my favorite in the series, but it was the first one I read and it got me hooked. Iruka blinked at him. You've read the whole series? It came out more judgmentally than he'd intended, and Hound pulled the book to his chest a little defensively. They're good. There's lots of drama and the romance is cute. He looked away, and a blush was creeping down his neck again. You own one too, so you don't get to judge. I only have it because Eagle gave it to me yet, he gave me my first one. He looked down at the book in his hands. The men on the cover flexed their biceps at him, and when he looked back up he gave Iruka a considering look. He gave you this one too, huh? Iruka opened his mouth to say that it was actually his second, and then he realized what it meant that Hound had the copy with the two men on the cover. Oh, he said, and then, oh. And then he blushed. A sudden rap on the window interrupted them, and he turned to find Eagle perched on the windowsill. Oh, hello, Hound, he said, sounding very pleased and a little bit smug to find them together. I see you two are friends again. And then he looked at them properly and noticed first Iruka's pink cheeks and then the book in Hound's hand, and Iruka saw the mental leap he made to jump to the wrong conclusion. He jabbed a finger at Eagle. No, he said. Don't even think about it. Don't say a word. Eagle held up his hands. I'm not here to judge your tastes in literature, he said, and Iruka took in a deep breath and tried to count to 10. I have to say, a few of us did suspect that the two of you might end up reading together. Really, Hound said flatly, and Iruka turned and shot him an outraged look for not denying everything. Of course, you are a little old for Iruka, Eagle said with a touch of disapproval. According to Umbu, I've canoodled with half the boys in Konoha. You'll get used to it too, give it time. Iruka shivered at the thought. Then he asked, have you canoodled with half the boys in Konoha? Only one or two? Iruka looked at him with something like awe. He had never canoodled with anyone, and he found himself wondering, not for the first time, what Hound looked like beneath the mask. Is that book actually good? He asked, suddenly feeling a little shy. Yeah. I'll read you my favorite parts if you want. When Iruka squeaked, Hound laughed, and it was the first time Iruka could ever remember hearing him amused. He had a pleasant laugh, and Iruka hoped he would hear it again. Don't worry, Hound said, I won't read you any sexy bits. The first time I read this, I skipped all those parts and it was still a really good story. He settled himself onto the couch, already flicking through the book, and for perhaps the first time, he actually looked relaxed. Iruka didn't know if it was the book or because they were no longer fighting, but he felt his own racing pulse calm down just looking at Hound. It was nice to see him comfortable in Iruka's presence. Iruka could get used to that. Hound patted the seat next to him, and Iruka curled up beside him on the sofa, flipped the bird at the window in case Eagle was watching, and then he laughed as Hound started his dramatic reading. Somewhere outside, a watching Umbu detached from their post, heading off towards the Hokage Tower to report that Iruka's first B-rank mission had been a resounding success.